conference, and he will give a brief overview and share his perspective on strategy and what that is. So I'll pass it on to him.
Thank you. Have I got a little clicker for this guy by chance? Perfect. All right, great. So again, I'm Kevin Bryan. I'm a professor of strategic management here at the Rotman School. My background's in I have a PhD in game theory, so my background's in sort of formal analyses of strategy. And I want to talk you through three stories, basically three historical cases. They're not actually, most of them aren't related to firms at all, but I think they'll be useful in thinking about how sort of strategy differs from, general good business practices or good operational effectiveness. And what I hope you take out of it is that there's a danger for someone in the consulting industry, as well as, say, someone at a business school. There's a danger because there's a lot of BS. Okay, let's be real. There's a lot of buzzwords and a lot of BS being thrown around both in business schools and both in the strategic consulting industry. That doesn't mean that the business schools and strategic consulting industry aren't useful. They can be useful as long as you understand what the useful role you can play as a consultant is, and you understand what the difference between BS and a useful role is. So let me walk you through just a few slides. I'm not sure who I need to flip these. All right, awesome, cool. So what I have up on a map here is what was called the Hudson's Bay Territory. So if you see this map, you can kind of tell that this is Canada. There's Montreal on the map going up to Greenland on the top. And this huge area in purple was actually a government monopoly for a British company called the Hudson's Bay Company from 1620 into the 1800s. They were the only ones allowed to ship products through the Hudson's Bay. Now, why was this useful? Because when the Hudson's Bay was clear of ice in the summertime, it turns out that the distance from this location, York Factory, it's near modern Churchill, Manitoba, from York Factory to London, England, is about the same shipping distance as from Montreal to London, England. So you probably know that in the early history of Canada, fur was the main product that they exported. That's sort of where Canada's early riches come from. And in general, the fur came from the Arctic regions or the west of Canada. And so having a monopoly that allows you to ship your goods through the Hudson Bay and no one else having that same right was a massive competitive advantage. And so from 1620 onward, the folks working for the Hudson's Bay Company were in the west of Canada. Generally how they operated, if I can show you the next slide, generally how they operated was rather than sort of travel overland, they just simply had a fort, okay, on the edge of the Hudson's Bay. Relatively uneducated workers would spend the entire winter there. It was 1700s, they were British, so mostly drinking. They would wait, and this is not a joke, so they would wait until the spring. When spring came along, various First Nations that they worked with, who'd themselves traded with people further south, would bring them furs and blankets and things of this nature, which were then shipped in the summer back to England. To get any news to the people working in York Factory, it could take up to 15 months for an order to come from the headquarters in London to York Factory and for notification to get back to London on what was going on. So it's very, very hard to change what happened. The workers were not really given any incentive to sort of show any initiative or anything of that type. Their job was furs come in, we pay for them, we ship them out, that's your job, okay? This worked really well until the late 1700s. 1763, as you know, England takes over French Canada, and a group of English residents in Montreal decide, well, the fur is so expensive, we may be able to make money by getting the fur overland. So what they did was they sent these mountain men, these some of their voyageurs or coureurs de bois, they sent them overland through the Great Lakes by canoe, up some rivers into Western Canada, all the way to the Athabasca River Delta, which is quite far west. These essentially mountain men were given complete initiative on what relationships to set up with local people, how much to pay for furs, what furs to gather. They generally wintered, in the woods, more or less, then brought the furs that they traded for back overland again to Montreal, from which point they were shipped to London. Now this took a long time because once a fur was acquired, by these coureurs de bois, it could take up to 24 months for that fur to show up in London, whereas if the fur was in York factory, it would generally take 4 to 5 months once you shipped it out. Quite an expensive way to do business. And yet, by 1810, 80% of the furs being sent out of Canada were furs being sent by this company. It was called the Northwest Company. Okay? Only 20% of the furs leaving Canada were sent by the Hudson's Bay Company. So this is unusual, right? You would think that the Hudson's Bay Company has this massive strategic advantage. Like, they literally have a monopoly on the cheapest way to ship the fur from Canada to Europe. So what went wrong? What went wrong was that the incentives provided by the Northwest Company to their workers were so much more effective in inducing effort in finding new sources of fur that the sort of more sclerotic Hudson's Bay Company wasn't able to compete. They could ship the furs cheaply, but they couldn't acquire the furs cheaply. They found it a real struggle to sort of open up new territories or find new sources of fur, whereas the Northwest Company could easily shift where they were trading, depending on the season, depending on sort of wars between various native peoples or whatever they needed to do. It wasn't a problem for them to shift where they got the furs from. So in 1810, you might think the Northwest Company, they know what they're doing. They don't need a strategic consultant. They're a competent company. Turns out by 1820, Northwest Company is about to go out of business. Hudson's Bay Company literally still exists. I mean, you can go to their store, it's down the street, right? They're the oldest company in the world, still selling the same product they initially started selling. You can still buy furs from the Hudson's Bay Company. So how do you go from 80% of the market in 1810 to almost out of business by 1820? Somewhat natural. The Hudson's Bay Company started replicating all the incentives that the Northwest Company had. They hired the exact same coureurs de bois. They said, show some initiative, gather furs however you want, but instead of bringing them overland all the way to Montreal, just bring them up to York factory. It's much closer. Then they shipped them out of York factory. And since they still had the government monopoly, the Northwest Company found it very difficult to compete. Okay? So what was the problem for the Northwest Company is that they thought very sensibly in terms of what we sometimes call like a best response. So in response to what the Hudson's Bay Company was currently doing in 1760 and 1780, this Northwest Company strategy of traveling overland and gathering furs and avoiding shipping out of Hudson's Bay was a very sensible thing to do. But the Northwest Company should have realized that the Hudson's Bay Company strategy is not fixed. Of course, the Hudson's Bay Company will just look at what's going on and then replicate the same kind of worker incentives, which they did. And once they did that, I mean, how are you going to compete with 4 months shipping versus 24 months shipping? It's impossible. Okay? So that's sometimes, you might think of that as the difference between like a strategy and a sustainable competitive strategy. And what firms are often very good at is identifying sort of strategies, things they can do in response to what their rivals are currently doing. And they often have a little tougher time thinking through sort of how the equilibrium, how the nature of the industry is going to change in response to the strategies they pursue. That can be a useful role for a consultant to play. Let me tell you a second story. So this one comes from a village in China. So this statue is from a village called Shaogang. It's in a province called Anhui. This village became quite famous in the 1970s. So historically, Anhui, actually, I mean, still today, Anhui was known as a fairly impoverished province. So if you were to go to Shanghai and show up at the little like kind of small convenience stores, they're called Xiaomaibu. If you show up in these, you'll often find a lot of folks from Anhui working them, same with construction sites and the like. So this village in particular was very poor. In the 1950s, during the famine in China, 67 of the 120 people living in this village of Shaogang died of starvation. Okay? Now, how did farming work in this era? There was no private property. So you had a communal plot of farmland. The government had a quota of what you needed to produce. You needed to meet that quota. And if your village exceeded that quota, you didn't keep the grain. It was all sent to sort of a central location, and then you were given your quota in return. It was sent back. 1976, Mao Zedong dies. The people in this village is fairly isolated. It's a very mountainous province. Fairly isolated location. They decided, you know what? We're going to split this communal farmland into privately owned plots. We're not going to tell anyone. We're just going to split it up. And we're going to lie to the central government about how much grain we're producing. All right? And if you happen to produce more than your quota to our village, then you can keep it. So this is a very dangerous thing to do. The penalty, if they'd been caught, could have been death. All right? Unfortunately for them, they were caught. They were caught in 1978. The local party head, though, was, this is the era of Deng Xiaoping, so the local party head is fairly liberal when it comes to economic issues, and said, you know what, there might be something interesting here. It looks like production's going up. We're going to see what happens. And so they let it go one more year. They didn't report it to the central government. Grain production in this village goes up 6 times from where it was in 1976. So this is exact same tools, exact same land, exact same crops, exact same farmers. Okay? And yet production goes up 6 times. The only difference was the incentive. So if you worked hard on your plot of land, you got to keep the grain, whereas before you didn't. Deng Xiaoping visits this village, and he expands sort of what happens in this village nationwide throughout the early 1980s. It's called the family household responsibility system, right? So these days in China, you'll find very few sort of communal village plots. Almost everyone's copied the way Shangang does it. So the reason I tell this story is, it seems obvious, right? Incentives work, right? So you might think, as a consultant, one important thing a consultant does is make sure that the incentives are correct for workers in a given firm. Now, the weird thing is that these type of what we sometimes call high-powered incentives. So incentive, like in this case, you get to keep all the grain you produce is basically a bonus, like a salesperson bonus. It's actually very rare. So most employees at most firms are paid flat salaries. So if incentives work, why do we pay flat salaries to workers, right? Why do we motivate workers with, for instance, oh, don't worry, I'll give you a promotion next year if you work hard, but your salary is just fixed? Why do we do that if we think incentives work? And so it turns out there's a really nice formal literature on where incentives don't work. There are all sorts of problems. You can investigate them yourselves, called multitasking problems. There's the team incentives problem. There's all sorts of problems that are well known in sort of formal studies of incentives, something called mechanism design. That if you were the head of a firm and all you knew was like incentives work, I should pay bonuses to my workers for output, you get bad results. Let me give you an example of where incentives don't work. There was, I believe this was in Baltimore, Western District of Baltimore. They wanted the police officers not to just sit in their cars all day, all right, and drink with their buddies and whatever. They wanted them to actually do police work. And so the local, it wasn't the police chief, I guess, one below the police chief. He knew incentives work. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pay you a bonus. Whoever makes the most arrests this month, I'll pay you a bonus. Sensible? Yeah? Right? Incentives work. It worked. I'll tell you what, it worked. What happened? Who won the bonus? One of the police officers made 28 arrests in 1 month. District record. There were 28 arrests for people not having the light on the front of their bicycle. Right? Now, obviously, that wasn't what we wanted the police officers to do. Actually, that's worse than if the police officer just sat in their car drinking with their buddy. Okay? And so incentives worked in Xiaogang, did not work in Baltimore. And understanding when and how incentives can work, that's an important job for someone in strategic consulting. A person who works every day at a firm, like an employee of the firm you're consulting for, they haven't thought through the broad issues of which incentives work where, how different industries have applied incentives. Like, that's not their job. Their job is to focus on the day-to-day issues of their business. Right? Your job as a strategic consultant is to understand broader theoretical issues that you can bring to that firm. And not just tell them sort of, incentives are useful. No, tell them exactly when incentives are useful, exactly when they fail. That's useful stuff. If I can go one more slide. So I got a third story here. I realize I don't have a clock, so I have no idea how we're doing on time. That's all right. I'll go over if I have to. So, professor's prerogative. So this picture, it's actually surprising. It's not what you would think. So it turns out this is a nuclear power plant. It's the nuclear power plant in Darlington, Ontario. So you probably, in your head, you think a nuclear power plant, right? It's got like those, big silos like on The Simpsons, right? I don't see any of those here. This just looks like, I don't know, flat office buildings or something. And the reason it looks weird is because it turns out that the main type of nuclear plant in Canada is called a heavy water plant. This is something called the CANDU plant. So the basic idea is that there are a number of ways to generate nuclear power. The basic principle is I cause a nuclear reaction with some kind of fissile material, like uranium-235. that generates some kind of energy. I need to transform that energy, kinetic energy somehow into power. So generally what we're going to do in plants is I'm going to, turn heat into steam and have steam turn a turbine and then kick the steam out the top of the plant, right? So that's what spits out the top of a nuclear silo generally. So this plant works differently. There's no sort of regular water in it at all. It uses something called deuterium. I won't explain how the plant works, but I will point out that it is safer and more efficient than the light water, the regular plants, the sort of Simpson-style nuclear plants you see everywhere else in the world. This isn't a surprise. If you would have asked, I've read US Department of Energy reports from the 1950s where they hypothesized about different ways to generate nuclear energy, and even then they thought these deuterium-based plants would be safer and more efficient than the kind of light water plants for the big silos. So the question is, why are there so few plants like this, right? The technology is objectively better. And it's not a surprise. We knew it was objectively better back in the 1950s. Well, it turns out that there's very good theoretical and empirical reasons why good technologies do not always win out in the marketplace. One main reason is that the benefit or the utility you get from technology depends on the complements that are developed around it. So for the light water plants, it turns out that the first sort of nice use of nuclear power aside from weapons was in a submarine, a nuclear submarine. So obviously a nuclear submarine, the natural thing to use is water, to transform the nuclear reaction into power. And so you had a lot of people in the early 1950s, both at companies like Westinghouse and GE, but also at like nuclear regulators, who understood how light water-based nuclear plants worked. And so a lot of regulations developed around light water plants. A lot of engineers were trained on light water plants. A lot of construction companies like Bechtel learned how to build those silos very efficiently. And so by the time we start developing these heavy water plants in Canada in the 1960s, the complements that have developed around the light water plant are too strong. They're too hard to overcome. We have all the safety regulations. We have all the engineering knowledge, all the construction knowledge, right? And so if you went to a company and a company was saying, look, I've got this new technology, just thinking about, is it like better than what other companies have or worse? Like, we just know on theoretical grounds and empirical grounds that's not a sensible way to think about which technologies went out in the marketplace. So we work, here at the university, we have, you might know our entrepreneurship lab, creative destruction lab. So we see, 80 firms a year. All the people running these firms are very smart. But I think the vast majority of them probably have the idea that if your product is better than the rivals in the marketplace, then you're going to do well in the marketplace. This is objectively wrong. And this is the kind of information that you can provide as a consultant, as a strategic consultant, because you should have knowledge of sort of broader theoretical issues. So you should know more than just the details of one industry or one firm, right? In a way that the people working at that firm might not know. All right, so sum up all these stories. Essentially what I'm saying is that I find there to be socially useful roles played by a strategic consultant, right? One of the roles you can play is identify what type of strategies are being played by rivals, by other people in the industry. It might not be obvious. Sort of like, how will rivals respond to something that I do? As a consultant, you may have worked with all the other companies in the industry. You may know a lot about this in a way that a specific firm might not understand. Why are certain practices being used? Do I pay salaries rather than bonuses in my industry for a good reason or a bad reason? Has changes in the external environment changed whether I should use salaries or bonuses? Like, understanding why I'm doing that is an important role for a consultant to play. That's not the kind of thing that, CEOs, people running firms, they're not business scholars. That's not their job, right? That's your job. Also, understanding these sort of underlying theoretical issues in pricing and incentives and in fundraising, when to use equity versus bonds, these are topics that you can provide sort of value to firms. So in the absence of strategic consultants, how do firms learn these things? In general, they learn them by hiring people from the outside, from other firms or from other industries. The knowledge slowly transfers to their firm, and eventually they'll pick these things up but it may be too late. So you can kind of speed up that knowledge transfer process. That's socially useful. So what's not socially useful is to, just play the role of like a yes man. Just spout off buzzwords. I understand people working for a strategic consulting company, they tend, like at the top companies, they're all very smart people. Everybody knows this, okay? But being very smart doesn't really help if you don't know anywhere near as much about the specific firm as the people working at that firm day to day, right? They definitely know more about their firm than you do. There's no question about that. Where they might not know as much as you do is in issues like theoretical issues, industry-wide issues, strategies being pursued outside the industry they may not have come across, right? That's useful content. All right, I can take any questions now. I hope that wasn't a downer. That was meant to be a pick-me-up.
Hi, Professor. Thanks very much. I'm not sure if this is working.
Sure.
Oh, great. It was very interesting, and I agree with a lot of the things that you're saying. I wonder if within the first and second examples you provided, that part of the issue are that they're the wrong metrics and that there might be a need for experimentation on like what are the right things to incentivize on. So I'm not sure if your conclusion from the first two are to sort of throw that out, or you did mention boundary conditions, of course, that are required, and I think that's where you're saying the scholarship and potentially experimentation can come from. So is a background in understanding the right metrics to develop, perhaps arrests are not really the right thing you want to increase, and maybe how hard those are to understand are key for consultants. And with people with a background in experimentation, as I think a lot of us as graduate students will have, can add sort of unique value in that area.
Yeah, so actually this is a good point, like how firms acquire information specific to their firm, like how various incentives are going to work. You're probably unsurprised to hear that the average person in the business world is like dreadful at interpreting evidence, okay? Like what cause means is very different than what you think cause means if it's a science background. What like, I just worked with a firm, I can't say who it is, a big firm. They, so essentially they had from some conferences, they had emails of some clients, okay, just randomly. And they wanted to know whether they could use sort of email versus instead of say face-to-face sales meetings to drive sales. And so these people whose emails they had, they sent off a bunch of like sales emails. They started measured outcomes for those clients and for others. Like it wasn't terribly stupid, except that it's not a random experiment because obviously like the emails they happen to have were not drawn randomly from the population they were selling to. Like they were a very, very unusual population, it turns out, because where they got these emails was from like a particular type of conference where the people going to that were very unusual. So the folks in this industry, very smart people, did not understand why the knowledge that they were gaining from this experiment was, I would say like close to useless. And they didn't understand what it would look like to sort of run an experiment to learn these things. So I think, but yeah, particularly for someone with a science background, I think that can be a useful role to play as a consultant. The one thing I would caveat with is, I'm sure you know from most of you guys have a science background, is that right? Okay, so I'm sure you know that in addition to sort of like pure randomization, we often learn things with auxiliary assumptions, right? And what a sensible auxiliary assumption to impose in a given industry or in a given business context is often, less than obvious. So another sort of important role to play, sort of as someone with a background like yours, is sort of identifying, okay, I can't run the perfect experiment I want, but I would still like to learn X. Like, how can I do it? What additional assumptions I need to make? How sensible are this in sort of the context of this business? How will people in other industries learn whether this works or that works? Sort of the bad way to do things. A lot of folks from the especially in say software or internet firms, they often just A/B testing. That's it. A/B testing. That's how we learn things. And it's like, I mean, you guys know as scientists that like control group and non-control, like that's not sufficient to learn many things you want to learn about the world. And so perhaps you can go much further in guiding firms than something more naive like that.
Thanks very much.
Yep. Yes. And if you don't have the mic, if you just speak up. I couldn't hear you guys in the back earlier. Or just speak loudly, either way. Yeah, so a lot of, sometimes I don't need to get them to buy in. I can just rely on, like, if I hire a salesperson and I say I'll pay you, 50% of all sales you make, I mean, what do they need to know to buy in? That's not a terribly interesting problem. The interesting situation are when firm strategies rely on what we sometimes call relational contracts, or sociologists might call it embeddedness. And that's the idea that we have sort of some mutual understanding about what rewards are going to be for each of us in the future if we cooperate today, right? And what cooperate means is like often not that obvious. So I can give you an example. Like the classic example is a plant called the NUMMI plant. So NUMMI was GM's worst performing plant in the US in the 1980s. Like quite literally the foremen had crowbars underneath their desks for the fights that broke out, okay? GM shut this plant down. They formed a joint venture with Toyota, all right? This is in the mid-1980s. And the GM cars produced in the joint venture with Toyota end up having the best sales of any car GM was making in the United States at the time. So it ends up being the most profitable plant in GM's entire system. Now, what happened? Well, they basically told the workers, like, look, they gave them famously like this cord that hung down on the assembly line. You could pull the cord and stop the assembly line. If you thought there was some kind of defect, you could stop it. That cost the plant $10,000 a minute, all right? So if you're going to give these employees that you didn't, literally had a crowbar under your desk, that's how little you trust them. Now I'm giving them the ability to pull a cord that cost me $10,000 a minute after they pull it. And I need to make sure when they pull that cord, they just don't, go out and smoke a joint with their friends, which is what would have happened before the joint venture started. The workers would only be willing to pull that cord if they saw a defect, if they thought they wouldn't be punished. Like maybe I think I see a defect, but I'm not sure. Oh, I don't want to get in trouble. I'm not going to pull it. So how do I get across what I want this new equilibrium to be, how I want these new incentives to work? That's actually quite a difficult problem, and what a lot of firms struggle with. A big reason they struggle with it is that they don't think through sort of the issue you're thinking through. How do I change sort of the beliefs of the workers as to what management's going to do? This actually happened with Toyota and GM. Someone from GM's headquarters saw what was happening at this NUMMI plant out in California, the joint venture plant, and they sent one of their employees from their plant to literally photograph every square inch of the NUMMI plant. Then they went back to their own plant and rebuilt like where the line was positioned, like to make it look exactly the same. What happened? They did not have high productivity at that plant. Why? Because the important part of the NUMMI plant was the change in beliefs among the workers and management about sort of what the implicit contract we were working under was. And if you don't trust, say, your bosses, you're not going to change your action in response to sort of like, oh, don't worry, like if you pull the cord, you won't get in trouble as long as it's like an honest belief. Like, if I don't trust my boss, why am I going to believe this? You know what I mean? Like, it's actually really, really hard to shift these norms. So a lot of firms actually have a lot of trouble implementing a shift in sort of the underlying mutual beliefs of workers and management. It actually is part of the reason there's a sort of stylized fact that across industries, it's not unusual to see 2 to 3 times differences in productivity between the 90th percentile firm and the 10th percentile firm. So take like in the cement industry, the 90th percentile cement firm and the 10th percentile cement firm are about 3 times different in their productivity. Meaning same number of workers, same type of machinery, I get 3 times more output at the good plants than the bad plants. You might think like, this is crazy, why don't the efficient firms just buy the inefficient firms and replicate whatever they're doing at the plant that's 3 times more efficient, right? That seems sensible. And the answer is, even the firms that are good often find it hard to change the incentives on new plants they start up or in new places they go. Right? So I don't have a great answer for it. Like how you change sort of the underlying contract between workers and employees depends a little bit on the credibility of your promises and some game theoretic issues, but a lot of it is quite social, and how you get that type of buy-in is a little sort of outside my knowledge base, but I'm sure competent consulting firms have people who are experts in that area. Yes. Yeah, you might imagine it's especially hard. In the case of Northwest Company, I'm not sure what they could have done. Okay, so I mean, it's really hard to convince people that what they're doing is not sustainable, or what they're doing can't profit in the long run. No one wants to be the bearer of bad news. Like, I mean, to take like a political example, among the young economists here at the university, there are 0 homeowners. All right, I mean, I literally worked at the Federal Reserve during the U.S. housing crisis. Like, among the economists here, we all think like it's going to be an outright disaster in Canada once this housing bubble pops. But no politician's going to say this. Who wants to be the politician who's responsible? Oh, why did you pop the housing bubble? You know what I mean? Like, no one wants to be the bearer of bad news in that way, right? Because then they'll take responsibility for it. So the Northwest Company, I think, is somewhat of a special case in that there was the advantage the Hudson's Bay Company had was so strong. It's like it's not clear they could have done anything. Most businesses don't have that big of a strategic problem. There tends to be something they can do, some kind of pivot in the products they're offering, or that can allow them to succeed. We worked with one company. This is a good one. Is the young man who ran it? He was like, wore a tie. He looked like a Mormon, and very, very straight-laced kid. And he was making these machines that basically grew like herbs and tomatoes on your counter, and they grew really quickly because the lighting and the water was all automated. Okay, so you'd always have fresh herbs, fresh vegetables. But it would cost like $500 in the market to buy this thing. And the advice he got was like he did some analysis of the market size. It's like not that big. Not a lot of people are paying $500 to grow, cilantro on their counter. But he did get advice from some of the people he was consulting with that there's like another herb that's like soon to be legal that in fact people will pay $500 to grow on your counter. And this guy, I think he's like still embarrassed to tell his parents this is what he does, but he actually like is building pot machines in Shenzhen right now and is doing quite well. And so often these type of like strategic pivots are available to firms. I think I wouldn't take the Northwest Company situation as like the sort of norm. But there are other ones like, what would I tell like a taxi company, in Toronto? Well, the answer is that it turns out Uber, the cars are utilized 30% more of the time than a taxi cab because the technology allows them to find new riders quicker than just looking for people on the street. So it's just like, even if the cost, even if the price was the same, like there's nothing the taxi cab companies can do aside from like essentially lobby the government for protection. And that's why they're doing it. But there's no magic secret. It's just, same with like another one would be Encyclopedia Britannica. They're a very small company now. They were a huge company. Why don't people buy encyclopedias? Well, it's because this guy, Jimmy Wales, created a free one. So what are you going to do? Encyclopedia Britannica had a website, eb.com, in 1994, literally the year the first web browser is released. So like they were totally aware of, the importance of the internet for encyclopedias. But, what did you want them to do? Right? It's not obvious. Yes? The employees or the companies? Oh, yeah, I think even in Toronto, a lot of taxi cab drivers are that are independent are also doing Uber pickups. But the taxi company essentially, like, basically what had happened was that they paid a lot of money for a license from the government to essentially have oligopoly power in the taxi industry, and now that's gone. And so, what? Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I guess you're saying they could have like developed their own Uber type technology. I mean, so even in China, right? There's Didi Chuxing, and that's like it, right? There aren't like it's not like every city or every old taxi driver has their own software, right? So I don't know. We can talk about it later. Yeah. I think you find it really rare that like a business person wants to see you like write down math on a board, unfortunately, but or a student. But no, so of course, like part of your job is to translate the underlying theory into words, into actions for the firm. The worry though is that if the sort of actions you propose do not have a good theoretical grounding, then you're imposing a cost on your firm, an externality on your firm, because your firm will develop a reputation as like sort of selling obviousness or selling BS, and you don't want your firm to develop that reputation. So you want your firm to have the reputation for like, I gave this firm $20,000, they came back to me, they told me something I didn't already know that's worth $40,000. Okay, you're hired again, right? That when it comes down to it, that's what you need to do. And you might imagine it's really hard to generate $40,000 of value from $20,000 of work when you start from the standpoint that you don't know anything about the firm you're working with compared to the people that work there. So that's a really hard challenge. So I'm saying if you don't sort of apply knowledge from across industries or from theory, it's very, very unlikely that you can provide $40,000 of usefulness to the firm that they wouldn't sort of already know. I think that's right. Yes. How do you mean? I mean, so you have what's your background? Environmental science. Okay, so I mean, it's the same. If you were asked like, what should I do about, is this a safe level of pollutants in this riverbed or not? How do you know? Right? I mean, you develop some background knowledge from your education, from your work experience, from whatever, and eventually you start to understand the issues more and more. I mean, there's no like magic bullet. I mean, I think the sensible thing to do is to, as a starting point, assume all the other firms in the industry are run by competent people. So I mean, I think you'll find if you work with companies that like, wow, like take all the people that could have started companies in industry X, 90% of them went out of business. 10% of them are still there. Those 10% are like pretty good at what they do, right? They generally are aware what's going on with their competitors. I mean, like, I sometimes I tell students it's like you should follow the Bob Marley rule, is that you can fool some of the people some of the time, not all the people all the time. So whatever advice you give, if it's based on sort of like, oh, I'm going to sneak in and they won't, generally that's not good advice. I'd have to know like a specific context to sort of answer in any more detail though. Yep. Yeah, I mean, like one of the heads of McKinsey is in jail right now for this, so it definitely happens. It's not legal, but it definitely happens. I mean, well, so he was selling private information learned from the companies to a hedge fund. Okay, so that's definitely illegal. The idea that some of the knowledge you acquire in company A will filter out to company B, I think any company that hires a consultant is aware of this, right? But I mean, there are laws around things like there's a formal thing called a trade secret, So like if you were a consultant and you learned like the recipe to Coca-Cola and you told someone, I mean, you would go to jail. Yeah, so in general, like good strategies work even when they're public. So I don't think that's a terribly, you know what I mean? Like if another company sees like, oh, they're using like this incentive structure for their workers, like, is that a problem for your company? Like in general, it's not. Actually, we work with a bunch of Silicon Valley folks, and it always comes up that, so I'm from the States, so I should be careful what I say about Canada here. But it always comes up that Canadian firms tend to be quite secretive compared to American firms. So we've had situations where like we've connected young firms with like, I mean, serious like billionaire level kind of people, okay? And they've been like, oh, I don't want to tell you exactly how this works. It's like, you think that guy's gonna like steal your idea? Like you're getting free advice that you could never afford. Like ideas are free, ideas are in the air. No one steals ideas, right? Like implementation is hard. And so in general, I don't think you should worry too much about. I think Canadian firms tend to be over worried about their ideas getting taken. Now, all consulting firms will have internal procedures about what you're allowed to say from one company to another, but yeah, that depends on the company. Anyone? Yep. You'll have to speak up from way back there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think if I understand you correctly, you're asking how do a lot of the useful advice I want to give, if I tell it to you, then you won't hire my firm? Is that essentially the worry? So this is like, I guess, more of a question for salespeople. Like you probably know, all consulting firms I know of, the folks higher up are paid primarily on how much business they bring in, and so relationship management is very important for them. So how do I avoid like losing business with a company by just telling them something obvious and not doing the consulting in the first place? Is that I think most firms would like to have a repeated relationship with the company, or a repeated relationship with a given executive. Okay? And so you basically think like, if I give you useful advice and tell you I can help you implement it, and then you don't hire me, then I'm just not going to give you that advice in the future. You see? And so worrying about the sort of continuation value of a relationship, I think is, I mean, this is just true in sales in general. Like that's the reason you don't screw over your partner, is because you care about using that same partner again in the future. Is that sensible? So of course that doesn't work always. I mean, it depends on the company. So like I did work with DFID, is the British Development Aid Agency, on how to do experimentation, and they were like, we have really bad outcomes when you run these experiments. And it's like, well, yeah, of course the problem here is incentives. So if you ask one of your like local partners in Uganda or whatever to run an experiment, and the result of the experiment is you should hire someone else, like they're not going to run that experiment that well, right? So providing the right incentives for experimentation actually turn out to be quite subtle in many cases. A lot of firms are really worried about, say, damaging relationships with partners, or they have very strict union work rules and make experimentation difficult. So even if you have an idea for an experiment to run, it can often be tough to implement that in some firms. I think, and of course, some CEOs just don't want to run experiments, but I think it's rarer than the problem of it's hard to implement a lot of experiments. Thanks, guys. Good luck.